So feel free to interrupt and ask questions as they come along, because this is an admittedly brief presentation of our rather lengthy effort. But Matt's going to lead it off because this whole planning process was really his baby. And there you go, Matt.
All right, thanks, Mary. Yeah, so slides here, I'm guessing I just have to say next. I don't know if I can click on, okay.
Yes,
right. Yeah,
they're running the
right
show from down there.
Okay, all right, awesome. All right, yeah, so just a brief review of this planning process. As Mary mentioned, it was it took quite a long time. Really started in 2015, late 2015, and we just wrapped it up past December in 2021. So better part of 7 years, though there were a couple of significant events that occurred during that time that really stalled our progress, but nonetheless, we did finish it up. So that was a huge achievement. We were all really happy for it to be over, for how long it took, and move on to the implementation phase, which is where we're at now. But anyways, this plan was a lot different than some of our past, or all of our past plans. And we do have a long history of producing these fisheries management plans that kind of outline species specific goals. And what we found is that a lot of those past plans, or really all of them, were too specific. Some of the metrics that were developed and the goals that were developed through those planning processes were based on data, but the reality is that they weren't really applicable to the populations that we have across the state. So they really weren't as useful to our managers as they could have been, because those really narrow goals that were set through the planning process. So we had some regions and some waters that were achieving goals, others that weren't, and it wasn't necessarily that those populations were doing poorly. It was just that they weren't able to meet these high standards. So long story short, what we decided to do with this planning process was to make it more broad, make it also more comprehensive. So we included not just species specific goals, but also some goals for our division, and both sections, the fisheries management and hatchery section of our division. And we also wanted to have more public input in the process. So in late 2015, we contracted with Responsive Management to conduct a resident and non-resident angler survey. And this included somewhere around 1,200 anglers that were spanned from southern to northern Maine, and then throughout our non-resident angling community as well. And we asked them questions, basically, how well are we managing? What do you like? What do you not like? What are the issues you have, etc. And from there, we really got a better baseline understanding of what we needed to work on, what we needed to improve on, and what were things that we were doing well that we should continue to do well. So with that kind of general understanding of where we were at the time, we then assembled a steering committee. And this included only one internal member, and that was a lieutenant from our warden service. But then the other 11 were all outside of our department. And I've got some logos there that you can see a variety of sportsmen's groups, guides. We did have an angler as well, NGOs, another state agency, our Office of Outdoor Recreation, large landowners, forestry, kind of a broad spectrum of the players that we have here in the state that we deal with on a regular basis. And that steering committee was really our sounding board. We met with them routinely throughout the planning process. Anytime that we passed something on to the next level, it kind of went through their filter first. So they provided a really good opportunity to get a reaction before it actually went out to the public, and definitely helped make sure that we were all on the same page throughout this planning process. Okay, next slide. So the next step was, now that we had the results from the angler survey and our steering committee assembled, it was to internally outline our plan objectives and content. What do we want in the plan? What were we trying to achieve? And so we created some really general outlines of sections that we wanted to include in the plan, species that we wanted to cover, and then also made some assignments to our staff to help populate some of those sections. From there, we used our angler survey and some other things to identify what species we wanted to cover as part of our species-specific management goals. So what we did there is we looked at our angler survey to determine which species were most sought after. And then we also wanted to include sport fish species that might not have been highly sought after, but were a high conservation target. And those two species that ended up in that latter group were Arctic char and lake whitefish. And the other 6 species that were included as like highly sought after were brook trout, bait and smelt, bass, which included largemouth and smallmouth, non-native salmonids, so rainbows, browns, and splake, landlocked salmon, lake whitefish, and I might have already said lake whitefish, sorry, lake trout. So we had our 8 core species that we wanted to focus in and develop species-specific goals for. And the next step was to get the public involved in the process. So we formed 8 subcommittees that included a variety of members of the public. You can see there in the first bullet, anglers to sporting camp owners, and then also our own staff, our biologists, which included some of our species specialists, the director, management supervisor, and game wardens were all involved in these subcommittee assignments. And we held a kind of training session to kind of kick things off in 2 different parts of the state, 4 subcommittees each, where we had the same presentation to make sure everybody was on the same page regarding our expectations and what really their role was in this process. And generally what that was we're going to bounce some ideas off of you, but we also want to hear what you guys have to share, and what we ultimately we hope to come to a consensus on what the specific goals, objectives, and strategies for managing these species will be for the next 15 years. So each group held anywhere from, I'd say, 3 to 5 meetings, and those were mostly in person. And by the last meeting, you know, we came to that meeting with a list of kind of final goals, objectives, and strategies, and bounce those ideas off. And, you know, for the most part, everybody was on the same page, which was, I think we had somewhere like 35 members of the public involved in this process. So it was a really, it was a really good process for us. And I think the public, especially those people that were present, really benefited as well. So next slide, please. So the next step was to work on our general division and hatchery goals, and those were all developed internally because, you know, we felt like we had a better sense of what we needed to do specifically as a division, aside from those species specific goals, to help advance not only our own staff, but some of the broader conservation and management goals that might not have been included in some of those species specific goals. And then we also had our hatchery section develop similar goals that included some infrastructure goals, species management goals, etc. So now we basically had our goals. We had our general division goals, our hatchery goals, and our species specific goals. And we wanted to try to develop some type of prioritization structure to pursue those goals, because the reality of doing them all at the same time, well, that's not realistic. It wouldn't happen. So we needed to figure out some kind of approach to addressing these goals over the next 15 years. So we sent out a survey to all of our staff within the fisheries division to evaluate these goals. And we had 4 basic metrics that they were going to look at. And those were conservation value, recreation value, feasibility, and urgency. So from those responses, we basically tallied them up, and we did weight them a little bit, those categories a little bit differently. Urgency had the most weight, but what we basically averaged the responses, and from there we came up with a prioritization structure that included high priority, moderate priority, or low priority, and we assigned those to all of our goals. At the highest level, goal level, the objectives and strategies did not get prioritized. Okay, so we had all our goals and now it was time to start writing. So the next step was to put it all on paper, which is drafting the plan. And we ended up, if you see in this image below, with 3 different sections. The first section I call our forward-looking section. It's the managing Maine's inland fisheries into the future. That includes all of our goals. The second section was the fisheries and hatcheries division's structure and operation. That explains kind of the who, what, where, when, and why of the fisheries division. So instead of looking at 6,000 different web pages on our very complicated website to try to find some of this information, there's now this one-stop shop that explains all that in this one volume. And then our third volume is the species assessments, which kind of cover the life history management, et cetera, of some of our most targeted sport fish species and some of our conservation, our high conservation value species as well. So we drafted all those sections, and then because we are not, we don't always write in the best way for the public to consume, we hired a professional copywriter to kind of massage the text for us, and then a designer to add some of these really nice graphics and reformat the plan so it was more digestible to the public. From there, once it was, we had this really nice looking plan that had a lot of really great content, we sent it out to the public for a 30-day public comment period. So we sent an email blast to somewhere around 250,000 of our email addresses that we had on file, and then also advertised on different social media platforms that, you know, this plan is open to the public. We want to hear from you. And from that, we got a really, overall, the comments were very supportive of what we were doing. We obviously got some comments that were just completely off topic. I think the most common one was, please stock my pond more, which was not at all what we were looking for, but we expected those kind of things. And we did actually try to respond to those as well. But overall, really great feedback, and also some great additions that we were able to incorporate before that final review, which happened sometime around December of 2021. And that's when we completed the plan. And as I mentioned at the beginning, now we're in the implementation phase, and we've got 15 years, a lot of goals in there, probably not going to achieve them all, but we already are knocking off a few. And I think that, you know, with the plan in place, we will be in a much better position 15 years from now than we are today. And we have allowed opportunities to kind of adjust things with time. So if we do need to make amendments to the plan, we will be able to do that over this long 15-year period. But with that, that's a brief wrap up of the whole planning process. I'm going to hand it over to Mary, and she's going to talk a little bit more about some of the brook trout specific goals that we've added to this 15-year plan.
Great, thank you, Matt. Next slide, please. And one of the things I want to start off with before I really kind of dive into some more of the nuts and bolts of the brook trout piece of the management plan is this planning process is totally in cooperation or in concert with our wildlife action plan. Brook trout play prominently within our state wildlife action plan, which really addresses the meat and bones of our conservation objectives for the species. So this plan addresses both, kind of elevates the prominence of conservation statewide within the fisheries division, as well as provide kind of guidance for managing for recreational angling opportunities into the future. So with that, out of this planning process, our first goal for wild trout or brook trout in general is to maintain healthy, self-sustaining brook trout populations statewide. And I just want to point out that this is kind of a new higher elevation of conservation overall for the species within our recreational side and management objectives for the species in Maine. If anybody ever has the ability to look into some of our past plans for trout in Maine, you find that most of our conservation objectives are kind of embedded or a little further down in the ranking processes that were used previously. So this is kind of our first really elevation of conservation of of wild trout specifically as a statewide objective. And we're doing this in a variety of ways, and our highest priorities are listed here. So obviously conserving brook trout habitat statewide. As everybody is probably familiar with within EBTJV, when we've gone through our status assessments for the range, Maine always kind of factors prominently as, you know, factoring highly in that best of the best objective. And so we take protection of resources, of our wild trout resources, as our highest priority. And that means conserving brook trout habitat statewide where possible. And just an example of how we're tackling this one, because we're a big state, lots of area, lots of water resources, lots of trout resources, and a relatively small staff responsible for moving these goals forward. One of the first things we have done is really identify those highest priority areas statewide where collaborative conservation is a goal. And on the map to the right here, we're highlighting where these areas are in the state. We really have two tools at our disposal to do this, something that we have internally for lakes and ponds, or actually not internally, it's a statewide law actually called our Heritage Fish Waters Law, where we have the ability to manage and protect listed lakes and ponds as heritage waters for wild brook trout and Arctic char. But one of our other tools was identifying those high priority riverine systems for wild brook trout conservation. And these are the green areas highlighted in the map here. And for those who may not be as familiar with the state of Maine, we're highly privately owned. Most of these areas are private lands, and we have to work cooperatively and in volunteer fashion, basically, with our private landowners to achieve our conservation objectives and goals. So this map highlights those areas where we are totally open to working collaboratively with any private landowner for improving the status and habitat conditions of our trout habitats. Obviously, another very high priority that came out of this planning process was minimizing and reducing the threats from invasive species. This has admittedly been a difficult one for us to handle because of our limited staff. We just really don't have the expertise in hand to really tackle invasive species issues as well as we would like. And as an example of this, I just want to point you on kind of that northwest quadrant of the state in this upper St. John. I'm not sure if you can see, well, you probably can't. But this blank area in the on the northwest quadrant of our state, this is the upper St. John River drainage, and we have muskellunge. That is a very problematic problem in that part of the state. And it's just, that's the driving factor for why not many areas up in that part of the state are currently classified as priority conservation areas, because we don't really have a handle on how best to tackle that problem. But there is hope for our near future. In our current legislative budget process that's happening in Augusta right now, we have the request in for additional state funding from our legislature to hire an invasive species fisheries biologist. So far that seems to be well received within our budget process, and we remain hopeful that it will make its way through final approval of our incoming state budget that hopefully will be in place and go into effect as of July 1. So stay tuned on that story, I guess. There will always be a need in the state of Maine to maintain or even enhance our just basic inventory and mapping of our wild trout resources and trout resources in general. We have a lot of water up here, and because of the issues of private ownership, it's not always easy to get into some of these areas to maintain consistent and updated status information for all of our species, not just brook trout. This is a problem across the board for us. Not to mention the time and effort and staffing requirements to maintain a level of data and knowledge to that level. But this is also a very high priority in our wildlife action plan. So if we can ever get Rawa passed, this would probably be one of the largest or one of the biggest things or the earliest things that we could tackle first is just staffing up to kind of meet these needs to maintain high levels of survey and inventory within our own state across all habitat types and for all species. Increasing public awareness and stewardship and public stewardship of the resource has been elevated within this iteration of the plan. One of the things that I have been struggling with as a biologist who has been working on brook trout conservation in Maine for over 20 years now is, you know, all too often we have kind of the perception up here that takes our trout resources for granted. And one of the things that has really been highlighted in my mind over the years in working with the EBTJV is how we really kind of need to shift that thinking, because the problems that are happening in the southern part of the range are migrating northward. They're coming our way. We're seeing the development pressures increase just like everybody else. And, you know, and this is raising the need to continue to remind everybody that, you know, we can't continue to maintain or to think that our trout resources are, you know, not under threat. They are. Maybe our issues are a little different up here than what's happening in the southern part of the range, but we have pressures, we have threats, and we need to kind of continue our efforts at elevating the role of public stewardship of habitats, especially across the board. And another big thing is really kind of adjusting or rethinking how we make stocking decisions for our hatchery trout in conjunction with conserving and maintaining and protecting our wild trout resources. This is a huge priority and is continuing well into the future. And just an example of how we're starting to address this need to make smarter decisions about stocking. As we have had a big brook trout genetics project underway with the University of Maine for quite a few years now. We have a PhD student who's in the final process of completing his degree program and is in the process of summarizing a whole ton of work that he's done for us over the years. And I can't really say more about that until that process completes, but over the next year for sure, we will have a whole lot of genetics information in hand to help guide our stocking decisions much more effectively, as well as you all will start to hear more about what we know about our wild trout genetically up here in Maine. Next slide, please. And of course, because it is a recreational fisheries management plan, we certainly continue to elevate the prominence of this resource within our state as a public resource and to maintain stellar wild trout fisheries as best we can. And we certainly do maintain a level of stocking in this state. And that will continue. The plan goes into much more detail on how we are tackling some of the issues related to stocking trout, especially in conjunction with maintaining high quality wild trout resources. You can certainly find all that information in our plan documents. But the biggest thing we're really doing is just in conjunction with a whole slew of different data that is now underway and efforts that have been underway for a while now. We are just making much smarter stocking decisions. It's a much more open process publicly. There is an opportunity for the public to review all of our decisions related to trout management, whether it's stocking decisions and changes in recreational fishing, angling rules. It's just a much more enhanced, more publicly accessible process across the board. We are also heavily involved which is better, smarter conservation planning overall and resource planning overall through a variety of statewide efforts. And some of these are in conjunction with what we are doing under the auspices of our wildlife action plan. But one of our other major planning efforts that we have within the state is our climate adaptation plan. And there's actually within our statewide climate adaptation plan, actually quite a bit that addresses the need to maintain viable, vibrant, native resources across the state, including cold water habitats, which is a huge priority for the state. And so one of the big things that we're involved with is enhanced and improving statewide stream temperature monitoring across the board. We're an agency that's one of the leaders involved with this effort. It's been underway for about 10 years now, and just a couple of graphics thrown on the right-hand side here just kind of helps show how we're doing that. This is a large partner-driven effort across our state, and we do within IF&W, we are ourselves managing close to 100 individual stream temperature logging stations across the state. We're closing in on about 500 active logging stations, I believe now, and some of the initial modeling coming out of the USGS using our data is starting to highlight kind of the northern and western tier of our state as being more likely resilient to varying climate change scenarios, depending on how you want to look at the data. This is something we kind of knew going into this, but it's great to see data actually showing what we thought was happening, but didn't really have data to show. Now we can show it and point people in the direction of where to go. Because another high priority for us up in here in Maine, because we're so privately owned, is maintaining high levels of public access to a variety of our areas and lands. So there will always be a need to continue public access. And this is a long-term, difficult effort in some cases for a group within our whole agency that deals with just that. And of course, our other recreational fishing management goals to maintain or manage wild self-sustaining and multi-age class stock fisheries, and to minimize harvest or in accordance with smarter harvest decisions, and to beef up where we can additional catchable stock fisheries where we don't have the habitat or the water quality to maintain vibrant, robust, healthy wild stocks anymore. So with that, next slide, please. That's really a kind of a summation of our overall fisheries management plan. And again, there is an additional information and knowledge within our wildlife action plan relative to brook trout and cold water fish habitat in general. And for those of you who are present here today in the meeting, I just will remind you that all of our states are going to be reviewing and revising and updating our wildlife action plans relatively soon if you haven't started already. So if you haven't or not involved in that process, you may want to be, because just a reminder, if we can ever get RAWA passed and successful through Congress and signed by the president, that program would significantly fund your wildlife action plan efforts, and you will want to make sure that brook trout conservation is part of that process. And with that, that's what we're doing up here in Maine, and it's kind of hard to summarize all that we're doing up here in a brief slideshow, but feel free to ask questions.